On this episode of Newt's World, on Wednesday, April 2nd, President Trump held a press conference in the White House Rose Garden to unveil his new tariff strategy, which he nicknamed Liberation Day. For decades, many countries have imposed higher trade barriers on the United States than America does on them. President Trump's plan intends to strike back with tariffs that are reciprocal, leveling the playing field with other nations. Here to unpack the new Trump tariff policy, I am really pleased to welcome my guest, David Beckworth. He's a former international economist for the U.S. Treasury Department and currently a senior research fellow with the Mercatus Center and host of the popular podcast Macro Music. David, welcome, and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Well, thank you, Speaker Gingrich. It's a real honor to be on your program.
Well, before we get to the tariffs, I have to ask, what does macro musings mean?
You muse over macroeconomics, because most people, their eyes roll when you say macroeconomics. So we try to make it interesting. What can be sexy and fun about macroeconomics? So we do our best, and we have some fun on the show.
So from your perspective as a professional economist, describe for the average person the whole notion of tariffs, what they are, why they're used.
Well, they have a long, rich history, so there's nothing really new here. In fact, we still have tariffs even before Trump stepped in. We've had a long history of it. We've also have a long history of negotiating tariff treaties with other countries. The WTO is a good example, World Trade Organization. But tariffs are effectively a tax on foreign goods that come into the country. And there's a debate as to who actually bears the cost of that tariff. Would the American pay for it or would the foreigner pay for it? And I can get into how we think about that, but there's that question as well. But you can think of it as one among many policy tools a country can use, and countries still do use for some objective.
What do you think Trump's reasoning is behind this sudden dramatic shift in tariff policy?
Well, I think there's several things. I just think he instinctually has for a long time disliked trade deficits. I mean, going back to the 80s, everything we've seen, like Japan, we ran big deficits with Japan back when you were in office. And then today it's China. And I think probably the biggest items or the table setters is China today and then probably Japan in the 80s. I think he just has this visceral instinct that trade deficits are wrong. I think what specifically now is happening, he feels like he has a mandate and he's willing to push things forward. And I would say maybe a third thing maybe to add to that is there is something amiss that's happening, something underlying the U.S. economy that does need to be addressed. I think it's something that can be better addressed other ways, but I do think he's put his finger on some unease, and people elected him for a reason, right? So I do think there's some unease out there that he's trying to solve, and I think there's other ways to do it.
Two pieces of data that I suspect affect him are that, according to the UN, U.S. manufacturing as a share of total manufacturing output worldwide was 17.4% in 2023, down from a peak in 2001 of 28.4%. That's a pretty big drop. And from 1997 to 2024, the estimate is that we lost around 5 million manufacturing jobs and experienced one of the largest drops in manufacturing employment in American history. Doesn't that sort of require some kind of response?
Not necessarily. I mean, if you look at a country, for example, like, let's pick Germany, okay? So Germany, I think, is a good country to compare ourselves to. Germany actually runs trade surpluses. It's also a manufacturing powerhouse. As we know, we probably buy many things from Germany that's manufactured. But if you look at the number of manufacturing jobs in Germany, it also has been declining over time. So in terms of employment, I think it's a story of automation. Quick point you raised about total manufacturing output, right? That share has gone down. And I would say that is a result of us shifting what we do from some manufacturing to things we do in Silicon Valley, Wall Street. We export a number of items. Manufacturing is just one among many. I would really stress, though, the employment in manufacturing itself is a symptom more of automation than I would say jobs being exported overseas. Now, it's true there was China shock. And I think you could argue the China shock exacerbated that trend. But if you go back and look at manufacturing employment as a percent of total employment in the U.S., it's been declining since 1950. And the best story is automation.
I mean, the world has been reacting pretty negatively. Should we be worried about that?
I think we should, because we still have a robust manufacturing sector. And I think that the tariffs, the trade war may actually hurt what we do have already. Again, just to be clear, we still manufacture a lot of things, but a lot of what we manufacture depends on imports from other countries. So as you well know, there's no such thing as a truly probably American-made car anymore. There's cars made in America, but they have pieces that come from other parts of the world. Most things have pieces that are produced other states, other parts of the world. So when we impose these tariffs, we're going to actually affect our manufacturing base in the U.S. Now, I think Trump's plan is in the long run, well, let's make those inputs in the U.S. But that takes time. It's not easy to rebuild a complicated manufacturing process here versus overseas. I do worry that when they retaliate, it's going to affect our manufacturing base. And of course, the obvious maybe first effect we would worry about, and especially, I think politically, I really worry about the 2026 midterm elections, because I think if we have big price shocks for consumers, I think they're going to vote with their feet. So Trump benefited from the fact that Biden really blew it on inflation, right? They had the high inflation from the pandemic. That was great for Trump. I just hope this doesn't come to bite him in the rear if the tariffs lead to higher prices here, at least temporarily.
I mean, it's intriguing to me that Trump makes this big announcement, and then the stock market just crashes. I don't think there's any other way to describe what happened in the next 24 hours.
Oh, no, it's awful.
I think the broad market index dropped 5%. The Dow Jones dropped 1,600 points. The NASDAQ fell 6%. Somebody said it's several $1 trillion in value disappeared overnight. Was that a surprise, or do you think that was almost inevitable given the scale of the change?
I do think it was surprising that it's been this strong and this persistent, because this happened on Wednesday and we're 2 days later and it's still happening. And it's in the stock market. That is literally wealth that has evaporated, which is going to affect spending down the road, which, as you probably know, Newt, that probably means a recession at some point this year. If things continue, they may turn around. But stocks are down. Interest rates on 10-year Treasury bonds are down, which usually means concerns about the economy. Copper, oil, all these things that are very cyclical are down, which really don't look well for the future. It was surprising that it fell that much, but I think what was also surprising, and maybe explains the steep drop in the market, is the fact that the tariff rates were so high, these reciprocal rates. There was the 10% universal rate, and then China got 34, Vietnam got 46, the EU got 20. I just think people were surprised how big the numbers were, and that probably hit them hard. In fact, it's interesting, if you go back to that day when it's announced, the market actually improved the first few minutes when he started talking, because all they heard was 10% universal tariffs. You remember he pulled out that big board that had all the rates on it. Then the market is like, oh my goodness. And then it started tanking. So I think the scale of the tariffs probably has some part of the story to it.
I thought the chart, or big board as you put it, was a very useful communications device. But the more I've looked at it, I don't quite understand how they got at the numbers. Can you explain how they, by country, produce these numbers?
Yeah, it's not the most shining part of the presentation. Those numbers were constructed, to be blunt. They literally took the trade deficit between that country and the U.S. and divided it by imports. So there really isn't any connection to like trade tariffs they're imposing. There's no connection to other trade restrictions. Sometimes countries can impose trade restrictions on our goods without having an actual tariff. They do some regulatory trick. So when economists think about these trade restrictions, there's both tariffs, there's other tools they use, and it looks like none of that was considered. It literally was, let's take the deficit. And I think, again, because Trump dislikes these bilateral trade deficits, divide by the imports, it is very ad hoc. I mean, Israel got a pretty high rate. I forget the exact number. And Israel has no tariffs on us at all. And yet we applied this reciprocal tariff on Israel, even though Israel has nothing. So it literally was just, let's take deficits, divide by imports.
If you're a really smart country and you've done really, really well, you're now going to get punished.
Yeah, more or less. You know, you mentioned earlier, is this something we should worry about? I do think it affects, long-term relationships between the U.S. and other countries. I think what Trump has right is his focus on China. And we need allies to fight China. This contest we're going to have with China, the economy, security, all these things, we need allies at our side. And I worry that this elevated trade war is really going to push them away. Why would they want to come to the table with us now if we burn them on trade?
You recently wrote an article, which I thought was interesting, called From Liberation Day to Stagflation Return. For the average person, could you explain what stagflation is?
Stagflation is when you have both high inflation and high unemployment. Or another way of saying that is you have both like a recession, the economy's weak, and inflation goes up. Usually they don't do that. So usually you have high inflation, the economy's running hot. And as you know, you're an historian, Newt. 1970s, classic case of this. It was an awful time. A lot of malaise. You can probably describe it better than I can. That's stagflation.
Do you expect with this combined impact of raising prices on imports and slowing the economy that you could, in fact, end up having inflation because prices go up at the same time that you're having more unemployment?
Absolutely. And that's my big concern. Again, and this feeds into the point I made earlier. If we get some little taste of stagflation, I really think it could hurt the GOP's prospects in 2026. But here's why I'm concerned about this. So just off the bat, these are really high tariff rates, and that means higher prices for U.S. consumers. And that's something that President Trump and his team has acknowledged. They're like, look, there's going to be some pain, and they hope there'll be long-term gain. So let's acknowledge that things are going to get more expensive. Number one. Number two, though, U.S. consumers are already scarred from the high inflation in the pandemic. If you look at any number of measures, they're very sensitive. In fact, they're more sensitive now than they were in 2018, 2020. The last time Trump imposed a trade war, of course, it was much smaller scale back then, but he could afford to have more room to play because people's inflation expectations were better grounded. But if you look at anything like survey measures, if you look at Google searches for inflation, they're at a higher level now than they were pre-2020. You're kind of playing with fire here. You're going to increase prices. People are looking for price increases to panic and to react. And then on top of that, we're running big budget deficits, and they look like they're only going to get larger. And I mean, how do you pay for these deficits? Well, at some point, we got to print money. We got to monetize the debt. You create this atmosphere, man, that looks like there's going to be inflation and become self-fulfilling. And then the Fed might become more politicized. So there's all these pieces that are potentially put in place that could lead to stagflation. I'm not saying it's going to happen. If Trump were to pull back on the trade war, if Congress were to step up and say, no, we don't want to do this, we could avoid it. I'm just worried that kind of a perfect storm is brewing, and all the good that President Trump could do might be undermined by it.
You made a point in some of your writing that there's a potentially real threat to the Fed's independence. Why does that matter?
We want a central bank, our Federal Reserve, to set monetary conditions. So that's controlling interest rates. Back in the day, that was controlling the money supply. We want to do that in a manner so that they hit low inflation. Now, we can argue over what's appropriate low inflation, but they target 2%. And we want them to have full flexibility in getting to 2%. If the president comes in and says, no, you need to cut interest rates right now because, look, my trade war is causing pain and Americans need relief. And that's something that I could easily see happening. And if they don't want to because inflation hasn't come down, they're going to be under political pressure. And so if they cave, what happens then is they cut rates, they fuel more inflation, and we get back to a stagflationary environment. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but it could happen, and that definitely happened in the 1970s. Arthur Burns, Lyndon Johnson. There were a number of stories from the 70s where the Fed got politicized and contributed to that kind of environment.
Because Trump has been a businessman his whole career and has seen recessions and has seen recoveries, what do you think is in his head? Does he just see him riding this out because economies go up and go down? He's got to have some sense that the 26 election matters. There's a certain amount of rolling the dice here.
That's a great question. I wish I could read his mind and know what's happening. If he really thinks bilateral trade deficits are an indication of weakness. And I'm happy to discuss why I think that's wrong, but I think it's a principle. You could say Trump is driven by principle maybe at some level here because he wants to fix that. I mean, notice that those tariffs that were introduced, if you think about it, it's a statement about a bunch of bilateral trade deficits. It's not really a focus on the overall trade balance of the U.S. It's all these countries. I think he just has this firm conviction. I do wonder what he's thinking because his advisors himself, they have to be aware. He came out today and said, look, we're going to stick this out. In fact, China announced they're going to match the 34% tariffs we're planning on them. They're going to match it on us. And Trump says, I'm in this for the long game. I mean, so maybe there's a little ego in there as well, but I think maybe Trump's driven by principle and is willing to kind of suck it up.
I was struck. I saw on YouTube an interview with Trump, I think in the 80s, and he's making the same case. It's clear that he really does believe that we've been taken advantage of and that we need to reshape our international economic policy. And this goes back 40 years.
Yeah, for sure. I am sympathetic to concerns about China, national security. There is a place to make sure we're producing our weapons, not somebody else. You know, we want to be leading the game in AI, technology, whatever the cutting edge is. There's a case for that. I do think some of the concerns about bilateral trade deficits are a bit misguided and they may lead us to a path that may ultimately cause problems. We all run bilateral trade deficits in our lives. I run a trade deficit at my grocery store. I bring groceries home. I don't give them goods. My clothes, households, firms, countries, bilateral trade deficits aren't necessarily a bad thing. You can argue maybe the U.S.'s overall trade deficit is a symptom of where capital flows come and go from, but an individual bilateral trade deficit, I think, is a harder case to make.
What is his legal authority to just arbitrarily raise and lower tariffs? I mean, is that written into law that the president can do that?
I think it's this emergency authority that was given to the president, this trade authority. I mean, you probably know that answer to that question better than I do. But constitutionally, I think this is a point maybe you're getting at. Constitutionally, Congress should be the final arbiter. The reason the president can is because Congress has given some of that back to the president, even though in the Constitution it's supposed to be with Congress.
So in a sense, they've delegated it to him.
They have. In most cases, that makes sense because some of these treaties are very complicated, right? If you're doing a massive free trade agreement with the European Union, lots of countries involved, it's cumbersome to have Congress with a bunch of people try to nitpick over it. It's better to have the executive branch do it. But when you have the scale as big as this, when it's a massive trade war, then maybe it's time for Congress to step back in and say, okay, is this what we want? Maybe they do want to support Trump, but let's talk about it. Look, Rand Paul is uneasy with it. It was interesting today. Ted Cruz came out. Now, he didn't stop Trump, but he's like, look, I'm concerned about prices affecting my constituents. So maybe we're beginning to see some kind of groundswell. We'll see some people raise questions, or maybe they're just covering their rears too. I don't know.
You go from a broad, general, sweeping idea to a specific series of actions, and then you begin to have people who are affected by those actions point out exactly what they mean in the real world. And all of a sudden, it's a totally different conversation. I personally would expect both the House and Senate to have hearings and bring in the Trump team and say, tell us how you got to this. Walk us through this. It just seems to me that it's a very large, dramatic change carried out in one press conference. In that sense, Franklin Roosevelt would be very proud of Trump.
Right. This goes back to the point you made earlier. Why was the market so surprised, right? Economists, market people say the market is a powerful institution because it brings together all the wisdom, all the insights of people who have skin in the game. They get paid to follow Congress closely. They get paid to follow the president and the executive decisions closely. And if they were this surprised by it, as evidenced by the crash in the markets, it truly was something historical. I mean, and that's what I've told my family is like, guys, we are living through an historical moment. I mean, I never thought I would be living through a time like this. I thought this was something for the textbooks, but I guess I'm living in history.
I tell people all the time that this is the fifth great transformation in American history, if you count Jefferson, Jackson, Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt. And whether or not Trump can pull it off, we'll find out over time. But he clearly has a sense of his own destiny of profoundly ending the Rooseveltian era and the centralized bureaucratic structure that was the primary weapon of that era. And this is what people need to understand. This is not just about the United States. This is about every country in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. The international order is definitely being shocked long and hard by this. I think it'll be some time before we can all make sense of it. I believe it's next week they're having the spring meetings at the IMF and World Bank in Washington, D.C. It happens in the spring and the fall, as you know. And what happens is all the foreign finance ministers come into town. All the central bankers come into town. They have meetings. Well, I'm willing to bet money that these next meetings, all these foreign finance ministers are going to bring an elevator pitch to President Trump why their country should be exempt. And this is maybe the final critique I'll mention of the tariffs. I suspect Trump will be open to negotiation, and that's who he is. That was one of the critiques earlier, was on, off, on, off. And if he does that, there's going to be more uncertainty. The more you change your mind, the harder it is for businesses to plan and to build plans and to hire people. So whatever your view is on tariffs, the global trading systems, if you could just nail it down and then let businesses plan and move ahead.
You've caught one of the great challenges of a Trumpian presidency, which is that he loves to negotiate. He has this very deep belief that because we're the biggest economy, we have far and away the greatest leverage. And so in a sense, if he can get all these countries into bilaterals, he has a feeling like he will almost always win because our market's just so much more desirable. But I think the downside of that is you create a lot of uncertainty and make it almost impossible for businesses to do any serious planning.
Yeah, we see evidence of that already. Steel plants, auto factories, there's even been some layoffs, but the PMI is a measure of business plans. And a number of surveys have shown that businesses are putting cash on the sideline and waiting. And the question is, how long will they wait? Because if things change month to month, if nothing else, that uncertainty may be a drag on economic growth, even beyond the actual price shocks we get from tariffs.
I saw a study the other day. Overwhelmingly, the companies that are worth $1 trillion are American, with the exception of Saudi Arabian Oil and Aramco, and 2 Chinese companies. And there are no European companies in that league. But the American companies are all global companies. So imagine you're sitting at Apple or Google or whatever, and you're trying to compute all of these different tariffs. And then you're trying to compute the reaction of each country. It's going to be a very complicated process.
Right. And I have concerns about this. Another one is this may actually add more water to the swamp. Trump's doing an amazing job draining the swamp. And you mentioned earlier, shrinking the administrative state. I think that's a very long overdue goal. I think I shared that view with you. But what he's also doing, though, is opening the door for lobbyists to plead the case for their country or their industry. That is something that you cannot get away. If you're going to negotiate with all these countries, I believe it was the first month or two when he imposed the first set of tariffs on Canada and Mexico, the 3 big automakers in the U.S. went to visit him. That's just a signal of what's to come. And who has the deepest pockets to lobby? I mean, K Street is going to be happy about this, and more than anyone.
This could be the Lobbyist Enrichment Act.
Fair enough, yes.
Which would be the opposite, I think, of what Trump and his supporters intended.
Yep.
My guess is every country in the world is going to be hiring somebody. And then every major company is going to be hiring somebody. And then imagine internally between accountants and lawyers trying to sort out what this stuff means. And this is not a binary game. This is a multi-partner game in which Vietnam may make a decision which has an impact on the Philippines, which then has an impact on Cambodia. It's really going to be a very dynamic and very complicated environment.
Yeah, for sure.
You, on the other hand, will have many opportunities.
Yeah. You mentioned this is a great opportunity for lobbyists. It's also a great opportunity for people like me who work at think tanks and people like you, Newt, who get to talk about stuff like this. Unfortunately, it would be nice if we could talk about other things, but I do think the uncertainty, the international intrigue between countries, what's going to happen to the dollar? You know, the dollar is this dominant currency. That's something I think a lot about. I'm not sure this will make a big dent in it. Keep pushing down this path. I myself want to preserve the dollar's dominance. I think it's an amazing tool. I think it allows for an amazing amount of financial statecraft. The fact that we're able to go after terrorists and bad players overseas and lock them out of the dollar system, it hurts them. And that's something I think we want to hang on to.
Somebody once said that having the dollar as the reserve currency is worth about 5 carrier battle groups. It gives you a level of weight in the world system that people don't fully understand and appreciate. However, I have to say, I have a hunch, looking at the demographics in China, that it's going to be very hard to replace the dollar. There's just this underlying problem that there's no natural competitive replacement. David, I want to thank you for joining me. I'm a historian, not an economist, and therefore I'm always excited to find somebody who actually thinks about this stuff from an economic standpoint. And I want to let our listeners know they can find out more about the work you're doing by visiting the Mercatus Center's website at mercatus.org. And thank you so much for helping us try to understand this dramatically changing environment.
Thank you, Newt, for having me on the program.
Thank you to my guest, David Beckworth. You can learn more about his work at the Mercatus Center on our show page at newsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Pendley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcast and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.